Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah and the rest of the Tanakh and the Brit Hadashah too. So that's what we're going to be doing tonight, looking at, I was going to do 2 Kings 1 and 8 and deal with some things that are on with Israel. But then I got more into this stuff and I said, yeah, that's a whole lot of stuff. And then I think I'll just do the king Jehoram of Judah tonight. And then next week, we'll go ahead and get into the two kings, Ahaziah and Azariah, I guess it is, and Joram of Israel. And also there's some good stories in there that in 2 Kings about Elijah and Elisha. And so I thought we could go through those and kind of illuminate some of those things and do some study on some of the practices and things that were that they did back in that time frame. So of course now we've got a different chart here for 2 Kings, and we won't be in 2 Kings tonight, but that's where we're going to be starting out with talking about. And this is a nice little chart because it gives you who the prophets were in the north and the south, and then who the kings were north and south, and then the various chapters. And so this is a good chart here to look at. And then we're still in 2 Chronicles way over here on the right. We'll keep on going through that for another few weeks. And let's see. Then we've got our little chart or map so that you can see again the divided kingdom, what it looks like, in case you forgot. And then I've got really having some okay, tonight we're going to be looking right over here at Jehoram in Judah. And the next week, then we'll go over into the other ones with Ahaziah and Joram in Israel and what they did, and plus the prophets, because the stories really are more about the prophets in those parts of the narrative there in 2 Kings. So I wanted to look at our moment in time this week. I thought about, well, what about the agriculture of the time? Now, whenever I go to a foreign country, that's one of the things that I really like to look at is their style, their practices of agriculture. And quite a few years ago, we were Pat and I took a little trip to Australia when we were living in Singapore. And one day there, while we were there, all I did was we took our rental car and we drove around, made this big loop of quite a couple of 100 miles of Australia in through their farmlands, and we saw a mango plantation where they had cut the mango trees to where they just look like little bowls sitting up on top of these the tree trunks, so to make it, well, square bowls, to make it easy for them to go through and harvest the mangoes. And then they also made mango wine, which was kind of cool. And although it was too sweet for me, Pat liked it. And so we had never seen mango wine again until just the other day. We were in a store and they had I saw there they had mango wine, but it was a blend, a mix of something. So it wasn't pure mango wine from Australia. So anyway, that was interesting. They had a sweet wine which was like syrup, and then a not so sweet wine which was like syrup, and then they had a dry wine which in my taste was still like syrup. It was still too sweet for me. But anyway, I like going through agriculture and seeing the different ways that people have adapted over the years to the climate and the conditions that they have. For instance, if you go to um, Scotland, okay, go to Scotland, and you'll see that the farmers there, when they're plowing, they don't do it like we do here in the United States of plowing on the contours, so that our plowing rows are parallel to the contours of the ground, so that when it rains, you don't have a lot of runoff. They don't have the kind of rain over there that we do. Their rain is just more like a misty stuff. They don't have any, generally speaking, don't have these huge downpours. I mean, it rains all the time in Scotland, but it's just, kind of a misty, kind of a rain. And so they don't have to worry about the ground running off like we do. So they can just plow right over the tops of the hills, or, just uh, however they wanted to do it, because they don't have to worry about that. I always thought that was kind of interesting. And then they would they built their little farm houses and their barns and everything around a central enclosure because of the weather. Then that way it kept the animals in a more sheltered area. And so again, kind of made I guess I never went inside of one of their houses, but they were in very close proximity to the barn. So I guess you just got used to the smell of the animals. But looking at the agriculture in Israel at the time that the time frame that we're talking about here, this is the Iron Age, okay? And at the time that the Israelites came in and conquered Canaan, they really didn't have a lot of experience with large scale farming of any sort. They probably could have raised a few veggies here and there in um, Egypt and so forth, but for the most part, the Israelites were um, they were pastoral people. They were shepherds. They kept flocks. They did not settle down and grow large crops. And I guess they would buy their grain and so forth from people who did that sort of thing. So when they got to Canaan, they really didn't have that much knowledge of how to farm. So what they had to do was kind of borrow from the indigenous population, the Canaanites, look and see how they did things, how they farmed and how they raised their crops, and then copied that to where they could then produce enough crops for themselves. Now, a lot of societies back in those days, the Philistines were very famous for this. They would just wait until the Israelites would grow their crops and everything was all nice and plump and ready to harvest, and then they would swoop in. And after the Israelites had already harvested everything and put it away for the winter, they would swoop in and steal it all. Now that's cheating. That's not a real good way to be a farmer. And so you find that one of the practices of the Israelites at the time was to be very secretive about where they, once they gathered their wheat, then like Gideon, he was threshing his wheat in a hidden place. So that the Philistines couldn't find out where he was threshing his wheat, and it wasn't on a threshing floor. He was threshing his wheat in a wine press, where they would never be looking for him to be threshing wheat. And so therefore, he was away from the normal spot, and so he would have been somewhat protected. from marauders. But that's kind of one of the things that the farmers back in those days had to contend with, was that foreign raiders coming in and taking their produce and everything that they had saved up for the winter. And a lot of times, and there were cases in the Bible where it talked about the enemy coming in and stealing everything, and then they didn't have anything for the winter, and then they were very hungry and starving until they could get some crops again. So another thing about farming back in those days, it was extremely labor intensive. I mean, it was the ground was hard, and it was rocky, and so they would have to, if they wanted to have a farm area, they would have to come in and take the rocks out of where the dirt was, dig those things up, and then they could put those over on a fence line or something like that, or maybe use them to build houses or something. But it wasn't just like going out with your tractor and plowing or rotor tiller and tilling up the ground. No, you had to go out and get the soil, enough soil to grow something in, and that meant picking up rocks. And at one point, Israel, the Ephraimites complained about, there was not enough land for all of them, and so I think Joshua told them, well, you go over there to where the forests are on the west side of you, cut down the trees and clear that land. Well, that's easier said than done also, because with the saws that they had in those days, especially at the time of Joshua, those were bronze saws, or they just used axes, and they were bronze. They weren't iron, so they were not really sharp, and so they really didn't cut the trees down. They just beat them into submission until they fell. And it was very hard work. And even then, they did not do it. They didn't clear those forests, because when then 600 years later, 500 years later, when David was gathering all the materials for the temple, for the first temple, he went and utilized those forests, those trees, because they had still not been cut down, and now they had 600 more years to grow. And so that was it was the land that had not been put into agriculture. In today's Israel, you see vast areas like in the Jezreel Valley, looking down from Mount Carmel, you can see really nice, beautiful flat land that's the crops are just wonderful, and they irrigate it. The land over in Israel now is if you just throw some water on something, it'll grow crazy, because the land is all volcanic soil with lots of minerals, and as long as it just needs water, and it will grow very much. Another thing that they, of course, the farming in those days was very dependent on the water, the rainfall that they had. So that's why when God says he will bless them and send the former rain and the latter rain, that meant the rain before the sowing of the seeds, so that the ground would be nice and moist, and the seeds would germinate. And then during the growing season, the latter rains, they would have rain then to get the crops ready for harvest. And so those were very necessary. Now in today's world, they irrigate with drip irrigation, so they're very stingy with their water, but it works out very well for them. And the major crops that they had, of course, were wheat and barley and figs and olives. And so obviously the figs and the olives were grown in what we would call an orchard, and then the wheat and barley was in fields. And it's interesting that the Bible tells them, God told them do not sow two different kinds of seeds. And I thought, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that you're not supposed to do like the Indians did here in the United States, or in the North America, and they had what they called the three sisters, where they would grow corn and beans and squash all together in one little hill. And so then that way the corn would pop up and make a big strong runner, or a big strong pole. The beans then would grow up around and twirl around the stalk of the corn, so they would have something to grow on. And then the squash down there around the beans and the corn is very sticky, stickery. It's got little tiny spines all in it, and so that would discourage animals from getting in there and eating the beans or destroying the corn. So I thought, well, what does that mean that God said, no, we don't want to do that? But no, what it meant was, you don't go into your orchard and plant wheat or barley, because you have to go in there and plow up the ground. Well, when you do that, you disturb the roots for the olives or the grapes or the figs. And so um, that was what it was meant by, don't plant two different kinds of seeds in the same space, because it basically, what you would get less of a crop from the wheat and the barley, and you would also get less of a crop from your figs, olives, and grapes, because you're disturbing the roots of the figs, olives, and grapes. And the wheat and the barley would not get all the nutrients that they need, because the wheat, barley, and grapes, figs, and olives, the figs, olives, and grapes would use up that stuff. So there again, the instructions that God gave us in Torah about agriculture, where they had actual practical applications. And yeah, I mean, God actually knew what he was doing when he was talking about gardening and farming. And so one of those other things that was done, and what God told them to do that they never did, Israel never did it, was the Shemitah, the 7-year um, sabbatical, where you would let the land rest for that 7th year. And I think I've already told you how I tried that one year in my garden, 2, 3, 4 years back, and I started on the 6th year, and I just in my preparation, I said, okay, God, I'm going to give you, I'm going to do this test. I've never done this before. I've never set my crops aside for a 7th year. So we're going to do that. And sure enough, that 6th year, I had so much produce that we canned and we freeze dried and we froze and we dried and we did all sorts of things, gave it away. And I still had enough produce that lasted us for 3, 4 years. And in fact, I could go out there in my garage now, and I still have a few bits and pieces of that harvest, and that's been canned or freeze dried or something like that. And we would have had a whole lot more if the mice and the rats hadn't got into it. But still, when God said that he would give his people a bumper crop on the 6th year that would last them all the way into the 8th and 9th year, he wasn't kidding. He did it for me, and I made me a believer. That's for sure. Nowadays, because of the world markets and so forth, Israel does do a 7th year sabbatical. Only they do it on a rolling basis. They take 1/7 of their farmland, and every year 1/7 of their farmland lies fallow, and then they farm the other 6/7, and then that way they have a produce that they can send all over the world. And Israel does a tremendous amount of exports to Europe, and so when they talk about this BDS business of boycotting Israel so that it hurts Israel. Well, it doesn't hurt anybody but themselves, because there's always a market for Israeli produce, and if they boycott it, they just you know they are harming themselves. So let's see, how much more I don't know that I want to talk about farming. There's some pictures of a guy using a one little a plow that I'll show you a picture of here in just a second. But this is the way that they would have done it. Very, very similar to this. And you can see how it's just one little road there that they're digging at one time. So it's not very efficient at all. But here's what it was called. It was called an ard, and it was basically just a sharp point. At one point, it was just it would have been a piece of wood that had been sharpened and hardened with fire or something like that. Then later on, they developed the skills and the ability to make a chisel point with iron, and that would look something like this. And you can see where that point, come on here, that point would have gone over that wooden point there, and then that would not have worn out. This part here would not have worn out as quickly as would just the plain wood from the branch. And then somewhere along the line, somebody had developed, this is a twin point plow, or two points rather than just the one. And so they were able to somehow hook this on, probably onto here, with just stick it onto here, and then they would have 2 points coming out to plow the ground with. Okay, and then of course this is a sickle or a scythe that they would use then to harvest the wheat and the barley, with that cutting the stalks and then stack them up, let them go ahead and completely dry. Then they would take them to the threshing floor and beat them on the floor, and depending on what kind of whether it's barley or wheat, they would have animals walk over it, or they'll have a threshing sled that would roll over the thing, and it would break that husk off of the kernel. Then they'd take that and throw it up in the air, and the wind then would blow the husks away, and then you would just have the seeds. So it's an awful lot of work to do that, and so much of everything that they did was strictly for somehow trying to get enough food to eat. Almost their entire day was somewhere, along the line, was involved in getting enough groceries for the next meal or the next day. All right. So, any comments or questions on agriculture and farming that? I didn't touch at all on their agriculture in terms of animal husbandry and their cows and sheep and donkeys and camels and so forth. Maybe I'll do that in another time. Okay, no comments or questions on that? Okay, then everybody wake up and we'll get into some scriptures here. There was one other thing that found a tablet somewhere in it was from the 10th century BCE, which is exactly where we're talking about now, in Tel Gezer in Israel. And on this it was talking about they had 2 months of sowing, 2 months of late sowing of seeds, 1 month of hoeing, and of the weeds, getting rid of the weeds, and then 1 month of harvesting and measuring wheat. So it took a lot of work to that, and then 2 months of cutting grapes. So during the year, that's how long it took to do all these different things. It weren't obviously at the same time, but you can tell from that it just was a very labor intensive thing, and they would have to use. I didn't show any pictures of a ancient hose, but they were not the slim trim little things that we have today. They were uh, in many cases a wooden hoe, and there again you didn't really cut the weeds down, you just beat them into submission. And they had bronze and iron mattocks and hoses that would cut into the ground. So all right, so that was the last bit of things that I wanted to talk about in agriculture. Looking at, let's go into Second Chronicles 21. And I'm probably just going to read through this thing because it pretty much tells the story. I'll stop and narrate a little bit, but in the 2 Chronicles 21:1, Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. Jehoram, his son, became king in his place. His brothers, the son of Jehoshaphat, Azariah, Yehiel, Zechariah, Azariah, Michael, and Shephatiah. All of these were the sons of King Jehoshaphat of Israel. Their father had given them great gifts of silver and gold, precious things, along with fortified cities in Judah, but he gave the kingdom to Jehoram because he was the firstborn. Now, when Jehoram had risen over his father's kingdom and made himself strong, he slew all of his brothers with the sword, along with some of the officers of Israel. Now, that is a terrible way to start, isn't it? Jehoshaphat was a good king, and he just made one mistake, though. He arranged a marriage between Ahab's daughter and his son, thinking that if they had they had a marriage between the two countries, then they were less likely to fight each other. Well, and that probably was the case during that time frame. However, though, remember who the wife of the king of Israel was. Ahab's wife was Jezebel, and Jezebel had a daughter that was every bit as rotten and mean and nasty as her mother was. And so Jehoshaphat's son married this woman, this girl, and because of all of that, the godly influence of his father was not nearly enough, because his wife drug him down to the very pits, and it was his undoing. And so she was just as bad. And so God said, "Okay, I am gonna come in here and punish Judah and Jehoram for the way that they act, for their doing." But he says, "I'm not gonna completely destroy it for the sake of David." And we see that Jehoram had benefited from the right of the firstborn. Okay, he got all of the goods and the major portion of the inheritance, but Jehoshaphat had actually sent all of the sons throughout Judah, and that way they wouldn't have an opportunity to really mount any kind of a serious threat to them. And he also ensured that they were wealthy and comfortable, and I mean, they had a good gig going there. So why mess it up with trying to have a failed coup where you could get killed and so forth. So long as Jehoshaphat was the king and they did what they were supposed to do, life was good. Only thing is, Jehoram came on. As soon as he had enough power that he consolidated, he went through and killed all of his brothers. Now, this was not particularly um, uh, unheard of. I guess you could say that a lot of the Eastern potentates of the day were kind of like that too. I mean, they would kill whoever it was going to be they considered a threat. And if you look going further down into Israel's history, and you had uh, what was it, Herod the Great. Now that guy was a sociopath of the first order, and he even killed his wife because he thought that she was going to be a threat to him. And then once he did it, he mourned and he was very sorry, but it was already too late. And yeah, he was sorry. He was a sorry rascal, that's for sure. All right, so anyway, going on to verse 8. Um, let's see. No, starting. I still got some more reading to do. Let's see where I'm at. Okay, 6 and 7 here. He walked in the way of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab did. For Ahab's daughter was his wife. I talked about that, and he did evil in the eyes of Adonai. However, Adonai was not willing to destroy the house of David because of the covenant he had made with David, and since he had spoken a word to give a lamp to him and his sons always. All right, so. The guy was he was a little bit, he was comfortable because God had a covenant with David, and so he didn't really destroy Jehoram yet. Except now it got worse and worse and worse, and so eventually he had to. And so in the days Edom. Let's see, here we go. In his days, Edom rebelled against Judah's reign and set up a king over themselves, so that Jehoram crossed over. We're talking about the Jordan here. Crossed over with his officers and all his chariots with him, and rose up by night and struck the Edomites who were surrounding him and the chariot commanders. Thus, Edom has been in rebellion against Judah to this day. Then Libnah also revolted from under his hand at that time because he had forsaken Adonai, the God of his fathers. All right. Now, what this means is the battle between Edom and Judah must have been fairly inconclusive, because if Judah had won outright and just beat the stuffing out of Edom, they would have at that point had to just stop and their rebellion and go back into submission and give tribute to Judah. But what it says was that no, they just stayed in rebellion through the whole time that Jehoram was the king. So they never were beaten enough to no longer be a threat. So it's either Judah lost this battle, or it was so inconclusive that they just parted ways and decided, okay, well, we'll fight another day. And but the same thing, there were other client states, for instance, Libnah, that rebelled against him, and we don't know actually where or what Libnah was today. It's inconclusive where that place is. We really don't know. One of these days, some archaeologist is going to find out, and they'll figure out where it is. But for the time being, we don't know where Libnah is. Okay, and this weakness that Judah showed here was solely because Judah and under Jehoram had turned their back on God, turned away from God, and so that's why they were not able to stay strong against their enemies. And so it goes on to talk about Jehoram. He says he built high places in the mountains of Judah, and caused the inhabitants of Jerusalem to play the harlot, and led Judah astray. A letter from Elijah the prophet came to him, saying, Thus says Adonai, the king of your father David, since you have not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat your father, nor in the ways of Asa, king of Judah, but have walked in the way of the kings of Israel, leading Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem into prostitution, just as the house of Ahab committed prostitution, and you have also slain your brothers, your own family, who were better than you. Behold, Adonai is going to strike your people, your children, your wives, and all your possessions with a monumental catastrophe. Now, we see that, Jehoshaphat had gone through and he had destroyed all these high places. He had gotten rid of them. And now Jehoram comes back in here. Not only is he not destroying them, he's promoting them. He's putting this pagan religion of the Sidonians, which was his mother-in-law, Jezebel, putting these back into Judah. And that's why the Bible talks about that it was prostituting the people of Israel, of Judah, in Jerusalem, because the worship of these various Sidonian and Canaanite deities, the little g gods, entailed both male and female temple prostitutes, and so it was a very very licentious religion, and there, it was just an abomination to the Lord. And so that's why he said that you're playing the harlot. Remember, the God looked at Israel as being the bride, and being they use that language a lot in Hosea, and also in other parts of the Tanakh, where he referred to Israel as his bride. And so when they turn away and start worshiping false gods, then it is like prostitution and being unfaithful to your husband. And so that's why this language that is used right there is so appropriate. Now, then said that Elijah the prophet came to him and sent a letter. So it's kind of interesting, because if you count some of the well, it just depends on how you count the years and so forth, or the stories and that. But some people, some of the commentators say that, well, how could Elijah have sent a letter to Jehoram, because Elijah had already been taken up into heaven on the chariot, and and thrown his cloak down to Elisha. And so how could he have sent a letter? Well, some of these people said, well, he had dictated this letter from the clouds up in heaven, and then he had sent it back with an angel, and so forth. But I'm not buying that at all. This is just what some commentators say, and that's not even Jewish midrash or anything like that. These are so-called Christian, or Christian, I guess you'd say, modern commentators on the Bible. And I said, no, it's baloney. It's just that we don't understand exactly the time, and we don't know exactly the time frame when Elijah was translated into heaven. But to me, this said, if he sent a letter, that meant that he was still alive, and not somewhere, on Jacob's ladder, with sending an angel down the ladder to go and give the letter to Jehoram. All right, but notice that this letter that Elijah sent on behalf of Adonai was not a warning. That already had warnings. This was judgment. And he was telling Jehoram, okay, because you have not, he's already sentenced him at this point, and this is the judgment, because you have walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, basically, you know, Ahab and his nasty wife Jezebel, your own mother-in-law, and leading Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem into prostitution. Because you have done that, then God is going to strike your people, the people of Judah, your children, your wives, and all your possessions with a monumental catastrophe. Now, that does not mean that all of them are going to die, but it means that there's going to be a just a big catastrophe, and then and it also says later on about what's going to happen with Jehoram himself, and he would die a horrible death. Now, any comments or questions so far while I scroll down here? Okay, I said you yourself will be stricken by multiple illnesses of your intestines, and day after day until your intestines drop out because of the illness. Then Adonai stirred up against Jehoram the spirit of the Philistines and the Arabs that neighbored the Cushites, and they rose up against Judah, invaded it, and carried away all the possessions found in the royal palace, as well as his sons and wives. No son was left to him except Jehoahaz, the youngest. All right. Now, there is a story that we'll get to later on in coming weeks about Jehoahaz and how he escaped. And then also his wife must also have escaped, because she causes trouble later on. So either they escaped or there was ransomed back, or whatever, because these people, kings, relatives, and so forth, in many cases they would not have been killed because they're more valuable monetarily to just ransom them and get a lot of money out of it that way. See, so one of the things is, now it said that the Philistines from the west, Arabs and Cush from the south and east, all attacked Judah. They invaded, in fact. Now, who was Cush? What was Cush? That was the name for Cush was named after Cush, the oldest son of Ham, who was the son of Noah, and Cush was the father of Nimrod the hunter, and that's in Genesis 10. And so, actually, much later, Moses married a descendant of Cush, and there is also some connection between Cush and Midian, that there's an overlap there, and some people say that there are some other areas that Cush would have been from down in Africa and Ethiopia specifically, but and in some English translations of the Bible, the King James and the New American Standard Bible and the New English translation, I guess, of NET, they talk about the Cush being Ethiopia. Now, Josephus in his writings said that he made the connection that the Ethiopians were Cushites. They were from Cush, or the people from Cush were actually from Ethiopia. And so he had that in some of his writings also. And in ancient times, Cush covered a much broader territory than Ethiopia does today. So that's why, again, there's that connection between Cush and Midian, in that possibly there's some overlap with boundaries of there. We don't really know, at this time what it might be, but or how that actually worked. But we do know that the Cushites were fierce warriors, and they were used many times as um, mercenaries by Egypt and others, that they would use these guys because they were fearless and they were fierce. And so what happened is that they attacked Israel or Judah, and they got to Jerusalem, and they took everything in the royal palace. Now, can you imagine going there, getting to the house of the king, and they just strip it bare? I mean, just nothing was left. They took all of the wives, took all of the children except for the one, and so even if Jehoram's main wife had not, if she was not captured, and it doesn't say that she was or not, it would have been a great catastrophe, because they're in the palace. They took all everything that they could walk off with, all of the gold and jewels and furniture and pots and pans, and so they just left it an empty shell. And so that would have been a terrible thing for the king's wife, and so then so that was definitely a catastrophe. So here's a picture of that somebody wrote of Cush warriors. Now, yeah, I think it's kind of highly stylized, perhaps. I don't know, but anyway, all I do know is that the Cush warriors were very very fierce people. Okay, last bit here. After all this, Adonai smote his intestines with an incurable disease, and it continued day after day for 2 years, so that at the end his bowels fell out because of his sickness, and he died of great agonies. His people made no fire in his honor like the fire of his fathers. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years, and he passed away to no one's regret. What an epitaph that is, that when you die, nobody cared. In fact, they were happy. He was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. Okay, he was buried, but they did not give him the honor of a burning fire of aromatic type fire that they would have burned to smell good, and that people would, it was just pleasing. But he didn't, and so and he had this incurable bowel disease. Now, I mean, that's just nasty. Whatever it was, we don't even know what it was. And the various readings that I've read on this stuff, people, they just kind of guess, that maybe he got um, somebody said, one person said, oh, he had diarrhea so bad that that his intestines and everything just folded out into big gross hemorrhoids, and that's what where uh, what it meant. His intestines fell out. And other people said, oh no, he had constipation so bad that it just so impacted and blocked that eventually it just blew out the end, and his intestines spilled out. We don't know. It's just gross. And what a fitting end for a guy that took over a kingdom, a godly kingdom, from his father Jehoshaphat, and went right back to the abominations that were in the northern tribes in Israel, and just basically turned Judah. Well, the Bible says turned Judah into a whore, and so that was pretty much a fitting type of end. King Herod the Great had something similar, because he would get up in front of people, and people would say, "Oh, he speaks like a god," and he didn't stop them and say anything. To say, "Oh no, it's just me, guys. That's not me." He reveled in it, and so forth. And God said, "Okay, yeah, we'll see how much of a god you are." And next thing you know, he was struck with all sorts of worms in his body, in his bowels, and worms ate him up until he died. And so now that is the last I have in this lesson. And so now you can go and get you something to eat after I've talked all about this good stuff. And uh,